we are glad to be together to talk about, empowering our students, right, ladies?
That's right. So should we introduce ourselves first?
That's probably a good idea.
All right. Well, I'm Mindy Kearney from the Digital Learning Team, joined by
Amber Bridge, also from the Digital Learning Team.
And I'm Beth Swans, also from the Digital Learning Team. And we're all coming at you from our online, off-site, in our own little caverns on this rainy
Cavern. Oh my.
I feel like it's a cavern. I feel like mine is.
It's starting to feel like it, isn't it?
I have an imprint on the chair that only fits me right now.
That feels about right. So today's topic is about self-assessment. And the reason that we've been talking about self-assessment is because we are hearing lots of teachers ask questions about how to get students more engaged in their learning. Right now during COVID, there feels like some disconnect between our screens and the distance between our students, that we're really feeling disconnected from them and from their learning, and looking for ways to maybe get them more engaged with what's going on. So a couple things that we then have with this conversation had is that with self-assessment isn't a strategy that we know that research has kind of looked at and talked about, because self-assessment really allows students to be more reflective in their practice. It allows them to hopefully be a little bit more self-directed, which right now we really need with our students too, because they're probably learning at home. And so we really need them to have some responsibility and really feel more self-directed in their learning. And we're hoping in the perfect world that that also increases their motivation. And when our students are more motivated, they're hopefully also more engaged.
And in light of the changes that seem to be happening in Iowa right now, this topic, although we talk about it for online learning, we also need to say that this also works face-to-face. So this is not specific to online learning at all. And one of the things that we have, I would say, really come to embrace is the idea of a way to help students really focus in on their own work and to self-assess is using a single point rubric. We're all familiar with the typical rubric where you've got a grid. There's all kinds of things that we're looking at the same time. Well, a single point rubric, which we learned about for the first time from Jennifer Gonzalez at the Cult of Pedagogy blog. And she gives some examples. She gives a lot of explanation. But basically what this is you take one specific point and you have, this is where the students are headed for. This one idea and this one piece of it. And then it allows the students to say how they met that or how they didn't meet that point. So it really breaks down the whole rubric into one idea at a time and allows students to give more feedback, assess themselves and give feedback of how they hit it or how they need to get to that place.
And a single point rubric really can be great just for teacher use too, or in the context of what we're talking about here, sharing that back out with the students, because it really helps to narrow the students' focus in. When you think about all of those columns on the rubric, I have definitely had my students self-assess with an analytic rubric like that, where it's 1 point for this, 2 points for this, or 3 points for that. But when you strip all that away, you're really asking them or wanting your students to think about one area. And so it removes those extra distractions for your students, and it really helps them to figure out where they're at with their learning. And we talk about the learning path a lot, I feel like. And so for students, when you hand one of these over to them, it helps them to figure out if they are on the path, if they are off the path, or if they have taken the shortcut and they're ahead on the path, right? And so we guys need to start to figure out ways that we can get these into students' hands, and not just a way that we're just going to hand it over. Here you go, let's use it, because we all know that usually doesn't work great. And so we have to figure out some ways to make it a process that's part of your class culture and the way to kind of help build that community of learners and empower those students to really help them to understand where their gaps are in their own learning.
Yeah, which requires us to do, some modeling for our students, right? So one of those structures could be the I do, we do, you do structure. So providing that single point rubric for our students with an exemplar of some sort, or even our own personal work where we ask students to go through and, where do you feel like I've really hit this, or modeling for them. Well, when I read this paragraph, I know that I've really demonstrated the evidence for this part of the rubric, and really kind of letting them see the process of it, because they're not going to know how to do that sitting in their bedroom at home, while they're working on the learning too.
But I also think it's super important to start this practice with something that's a pretty low cognitive load. You don't want this to be like taxing and new content, but to practice the idea of a single point rubric with something very simple. The example that Jennifer Gonzalez uses is making breakfast in bed. A wonderful thought on a rainy morning. So we all know what that might look like, but she kind of walks through, and it's something that students could walk through the same way. Making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, something they do already, that we can talk about. Well, what would the goal be, and are you meeting that goal or not, and kind of break it down into pieces.
Absolutely. And I think that when you start to kind of frame this up, you can either have students be a part of that process of creating that rubric, or the teacher could kind of share out where they're at with their I can statements or connections directly to their standards. With all of this, and when we think about this as a larger avenue of incorporation, right? We haven't talked at all, even though that we're from the digital learning team, we haven't talked about any digital aspect. And we kind of are doing this on purpose. We're hoping to set the stage today for you guys to really think about and process. Have you tried self-assessment with your students? Have you ever heard of a single point rubric? Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be coming back to you next week, 1 week from today, same kind of little quick lunchtime chat about how we can start to do this with a digital focus and using a digital tool. But before we step too far to preview that out, are there any other things that we need to think about when presenting this to students?
So one of the things that I probably would add in is that we are going to talk about a digital tool, like you said, but also allowing some space and place to do this work. So making sure that whether your students are face-to-face or whether they're remote learning right now, you need to provide the time and the space to do this type of work. It can't be just something else or something that gets tacked on to the end. It really has to be a living, breathing thing that happens during the learning process. And thinking about what type of self-assessment happens at different times in the learning. So at the end of the learning, that self-assessment is going to look very different than it is at the beginning of the learning, and thinking about the types of learning that I need to do. So really making sure that that self-assessment aligns with the type of learning that the students are doing and where they are in the learning, I think is really important, and maybe sometimes what gets lost in the translation of self-assessment.
I think also, just coming back to the very beginning of this, the purpose of self-assessment is really, we want reflection. We want students to be able to start thinking about what they're doing in a classroom. Have they learned it? Have they not learned it? I know when I was teaching, that was the thing that I ran out of time for. I always felt like the reflection piece was, if I had the time. Well, I think that all of our work with teachers and with students, and especially in this online world, that needs to become a priority, because we need to hear from students and they need to know themselves, where am I? And like Amber said, where am I on the path? And that's all about reflection, really looking at my learning, looking at it compared to an exemplar, thinking about taking that responsibility on myself for learning. And that's a new thing. So giving it may be a new thing, I should say. It's not a new thing in every classroom. But giving time and space for that shift is also really important.
I think that as we begin to do that, right, we do what we're asking, or what our series is called here, about empowering them, right? We are hoping that students can start to take ownership of that learning. And not only, and I've definitely seen this happen, right? You hand a rubric out to students, they're like, good, 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 good. I am great, right? But that's not really the intention with that single point rubric. We need to pair that reflection with some evidence that they've done within the work that they have completed along the way. So getting them to really look for examples in their own learning, and then kind of partnering that with that piece of that single point rubric can really help them to say, recognize and say, all right, this is what it's being asked for. What can I have that can match this? Or is it under or above where that single point is at?
And then they'll be empowered, right?
Hopefully
Well,
starting to take
first
steps
step.
that way. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And don't you think if you guys have tried a single point rubric, we would love to know about that too, to kind of
Absolutely.
help us build up our conversation around it. We decided to go live because we felt like it was a worthy enough conversation to want to push out and to also hear from other educators.